The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
You are back in the House of Mystery, and we're talking about this mysterious world, and I'm Al Warren, Mr. David Rose Martino, the donut killer, is co-hosting today. Yeah, Mr. Donut.
Yeah. Should have told you I snuck a munchkin.
Yeah,
a donut hole.
Yeah. Well, I could smell the donut from here.
Yes.
You know, it's going straight to your waist. You know,
it is.
You know, next time you do a karate video, people are going to go, "Oh my God!"
Yeah, I know.
You're going to have to wear get a girdle or something.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Tuck it in, you know, and then the people go, "Boy, he's in good shape for a man that age."
It won't show on camera.
No, see, there you go. But I don't know if you'd be able to move around very quick with.
That's true. I might have to speed up the film or whatever. Yeah.
Have to cut out that part, cover it up. You know. Anyway. Well, another great book we're covering today, and it's a true story, so we're covering history. Okay, so kids, you're going to learn something, you know. So we're talking about the Scandalous Hamiltons, and we've got the author here, Bill Shaffer. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me,
Bill. Interesting story. How does one come across such a story? Like, where did it fall into your laps? Like, how would you come across this and get into writing?
The story sort of found me more than I found it. I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and my wife and I had relocated to a new apartment about 5 years ago, and I was returning home from an errand, walking on Riverside Avenue. And at the corner of Riverside and 76th Street, I came across this fountain. It's called the Hamilton Fountain. And it stopped me in my tracks because it's quite beautiful. And I thought, this looks like something you would see at Grand Central Terminal. I do architectural research, historical architectural research, and I read the Parks Department plaque quickly, and it said it was a scandal involving a great-grandson of Robert Ray Hamilton. He left money in his will for this fountain, and it was designed by Warren and Wetmore. And Warren and Wetmore are the architects of Grand Central Terminal. And so as I was walking the rest of the way home, I was thinking, why would Warren and Wetmore, who were, you know, some of the most prominent architects in the early part of the 20th century, I was thinking, why are they doing this little fountain in this obscure kind of corner of Riverside Park? And why would they take that on? And so just my own curiosity led to a couple of Google searches, and I started reading about this scandal. And there were a number of blog posts about it, nothing in any kind of long form. And the stories kind of weren't consistent from one to another, or as it turns out, some were more accurate than others. But it led me to start looking into the scandal more. And once I started going there and started unearthing more information, I thought, well, surely there must be a book about this somewhere. And when I looked for one, I couldn't find one. So I took it upon myself to write it. So that's the genesis of how it came about.
I guess you have to go back in time and go through a lot of newspapers and different things. Like, okay, so this is occurring. The crime was 1889.
Right.
So let's talk about maybe give us the basic rundown of the story and what happened. What was the scandal?
So Robert Ray Hamilton, a great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton, he was a prominent New Yorker. He was an attorney, a state legislator in Albany, and a real estate developer. The Hamilton family at that time owned a lot of real estate in New York, his name was Robert Ray Hamilton. Everybody called him Ray. At one point, Ray owned 32 different either properties or building lots in Manhattan and Brooklyn. And I write in the beginning of the book that the Hamilton name at that time was a little bit akin to the Kennedy name today. It was Hamiltons, and the descendants of Alexander Hamilton were all prominent New Yorkers. They were financiers, prominent business people, philanthropists. And so it wasn't uncommon to see stories about various Hamiltons kind of as you would go through a newspaper on a day-to-day basis. So Ray met a woman, Eva, who was raised in the backwoods of Northeast Pennsylvania, and she could not have come from more different circumstances than Ray, in that she was born to an itinerant woodcutter, guys who were cutting down trees so that railroad tracks could be laid to haul coal out of what was called the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. He was an alcoholic, moved his 6 children around from town to town, wherever work could be found. She didn't go to school past the 4th grade. The consensus in her village was that she was, quote, not going to be bright. And somehow Ray and Eva met. And that somehow was actually, they met in what was sometimes referred to as a bawdy house. Eva was a sex worker, a prostitute. It wasn't uncommon for men of Ray's stature at that time to visit a prostitute on their way home from, their day at the office and drinks at the Union League or the University Club with their friends. And that's how you might end an evening. But they met in 1885, and that relationship was steady for 4 years until 1889. Steady, but infrequent, in that Ray was in Albany a lot of the time on state business. He had a law practice up there as well, and was basically only in the city, New York City, on weekends. He provided for Eva. She, was a bit of a clothes horse, a fashionista. He was always buying her clothes and jewelry, giving her money when she needed it. But Eva wanted more. She really wanted to be Mrs. Robert Ray Hamilton. Ray was pretty indifferent to that idea. And after 4 years, Eva concocted a plan to get what she wanted. She decided her plan was to tell Ray that she was pregnant with his child, and that the right and moral thing for him to do was to marry her. Eva never was pregnant. However, she actually purchased the baby at what was called a baby farm, which at that time they were basically illegal orphanages. Midwives would take in babies. If a woman gave birth and either couldn't or wouldn't keep the baby, she could just give it to a midwife, and the midwife would turn around and sell them for $10, basically, was the going rate. No questions asked, no formalities of going through an orphanage, anything like that. The unfortunate part of that is that babies who weren't deemed desirable enough or couldn't be sold were almost always victims of infanticide. So they were left to die, basically. So that was a very sad part of the research. I didn't know anything about what was termed baby farming at the time, but that's how it came about that Ray married her. So they became Mr. and Mrs. Robert Ray Hamilton.
So he's from a prominent family, and he's got a reputation and a name. So when he marries someone like this, how was his family and friend towards her? Nobody knew about it. Eva came back with this baby. She
she knew that Ray was going to be away for most of the summer. You would think, how are you going to conceal a pregnancy from somebody you see fairly regularly? He was away for most of the summer, and for her last few months of pregnancy, women had at that time what was called a laying in period. You could go, it was essentially bed rest in kind of the last 2 to 3 months, basically last trimester. You could go to a hospital and have your laying in period, but most often women would go to either their mother's house or an aunt or a sister. And because Eva's family was all in upstate New York in Elmira, she said, I'm not going to be here for the last 3 months of 1888. When I come back around New Year's, I will have our child with us. And so she did return with this child basically right before New Year's of 1889. Ray was introduced to the child that was, quote, his. And so a week later, they got married. They went to Paterson, New Jersey, and were married by a minister. There were no family, no friends present. And in fact, the minister's wife and mother-in-law served as the two witnesses to the wedding. And Ray's own brother, who he was pretty close with, didn't even find out about it until 6 months later, when Ray told his father, who then subsequently told his brother. So their wedding was about as quiet and hush-hush as one could imagine.
But that must have been, how did he keep it secret, sort of thing? I guess he wasn't close with them, or they didn't come by and visit him at the house, or did they not live together?
Well, actually, what happened is a couple of months after their wedding, nobody visited them that I know of in that brief amount of time. But Ray, he loved the outdoors. He was a big hunter and fisherman, loved the West. He had traveled there by himself when he got out of law school. And so he decided to relocate Eva and their baby and a baby nurse that they hired to San Diego. And he was going to San Diego. The trains had just started arriving to San Diego in the 1880s. It had gone from this sleepy little place to kind of a booming town with lots of beautiful oceanfront, real estate available for purchase. And they were only there, though, for 4 months. Eva didn't like it there. She lost about 40 pounds. She weighed 150 pounds when she left. She was basically 100 when she returned. She was drinking heavily, and it just wasn't working. So they decided to return east. They decided to stop in Atlantic City for a month before they resettled in New York. And it was when they arrived in San Diego that Ray let his family know that he indeed was married.
How did she integrate into basically high society once she was this relationship was then known?
Well, the short answer is that she didn't integrate because they had arrived in Atlantic City after being the 1st of August, basically, after being married for about 6 months. And they kept to themselves, the 4 of them, the Ray, Eva, the baby, her name was Beatrice, and the baby nurse. But after about a month, they were due to return to New York, actually on August 26th. And the morning that they were due to leave, they were both up early packing. And Ray said, basically, I want a divorce. This isn't working for me. It was, they had never really spent that much continuous time together. Once Eva was his wife, her demands for clothes and jewelry and money only increased. And Ray said, listen, I'll give you $5,000 a month. I'll care for Beatrice $5,000 a year. I'll care for Beatrice in whatever way she needs, but we're done. And Eva refused to accept that. They started arguing quite loudly, which had become common. And the baby nurse, a woman named Mary Ann Donnelly, who was also a pretty heavy drinker herself, got into the middle of the argument, and she had thought that something wasn't quite right with Eva and this whole baby thing. Eva had a couple of friends that when Ray wasn't around, she would hang around with. And she threatened to basically spill the beans and tell Ray her theory of what happened. So, of how she thought that Eva acquired this baby. Eva became incensed. Eva and the nurse were both drunk by 10 o'clock in the morning. Eva had sent the nurse out at 7 a.m. to buy a bottle of whiskey, which they both were drinking from. And the argument was settled by Eva picking up a knife and stabbing the nurse.
Wow.
Mr. Intestines by 1/8 of an inch, but she collapsed on the floor in a pool of blood. The police were called, and Eva was hauled away to the police station. So before there was ever a chance to kind of, quote, integrate into society, she was arrested. And it was that stabbing. Everything I've sort of told you to this point is basically the first chapter of the book. but that stabbing incident occurred about lunchtime on Monday, August 26th. By that evening, reporters from the New York newspapers, Philadelphia newspapers, Baltimore newspapers, essentially who could get on a train and be there by late afternoon was there. And the next morning, headlines were splashed across the country, front page headlines about, with the Hamilton name in it, that Hamilton's wife stabs baby nurse, basically, some variation of that. And it set off quite the scandal. Here was the Hamilton name in the newspapers for all of the wrong reasons.
Well, do you think that before the murder that Ray ever had, if he ever suspected that maybe this wasn't his child?
I don't think he did. It was never alluded to. I think that he was just kind of out there living his own life. He was 36 when they got married, which was a pretty late in age for particularly somebody of his social status at that time. In the late 1800s, you married in your 20s. You married a woman who was from your own social class. Your families knew each other, all of that kind of thing. I think that he didn't suspect it, and I don't think he ever cared to look at it deeper than kind of what the situation was in front of her. And just, sorry, one quick aside. The nurse ended up living. She wasn't murdered. She ended up surviving, and she actually kind of factors into the story a little later down the road. So it wasn't a murder, but it was. Eva was charged with atrocious assault. Was the crime she was charged with. But I don't think Ray was indifferent to the relationship and everything about Eva, I think, for a long time. And so I don't have any evidence that it ever dawned on him that this might not be everything she's saying it is.
So when she was charged and then sent in and she was about to face trial, did Ray stand behind her? Like, was he with her?
He absolutely did not, because Ray had some very well-connected friends in New York who took it upon themselves to contact a guy named Thomas F. Burns. Tommy Burns was his name. He was the chief of detectives for the New York City Police Department, quite a character in his own name. It was said that 6 guys couldn't pull a heist in New York without 2 of them being in Tommy's pocket. He worked both sides of the fence. He had a salary of $5,000 a year, but a bank account in his wife's name that held $250,000, which he explained were gratuities paid to him from Wall Street businessmen for keeping them safe. But Tommy knew everybody, and 3 days after Eva was charged with stabbing, he is the one who found out that Beatrice was not Ray's child, that she had been purchased. That, of course, if the headlines about the stabbing were, a big deal, once this came out, now it's just front page reading every day. And this is going on for months. When we think of today, a celebrity scandal that, satellite trucks are lining somebody's street and everybody's, tweeting conspiracy theories, and people are coming forward as having inside information about the whole thing. That was all going on then. All of the stuff that we would think of today is going on then. The only media outlet, though, was the daily newspaper. And the New York World, which was Joseph Pulitzer's paper, and was really it was the largest paper in New York. There were 19 daily newspapers, English language daily newspapers in New York at the time. His was the biggest, and he really championed the common man, the working man. And so this was a tailor-made story for Pulitzer, because it pitted the haves and the have-nots, and he was always publishing stories on wealthy and privileged people getting their comeuppance, as it were. And so this kind of had everything, and it was a big deal at that time for a story to command a full column on page one. Ray and Eva were full columns, page one, every day for months, and stories that even continued into the interior pages, which was virtually unheard of at the time. So it was a big deal. But to answer your question, Ray knew about 72 hours after the stabbing that the whole thing was a scam, and he absolutely did not stand by Eva, didn't even come close. In her courtroom appearances, he wouldn't look at her. She would reach out to him to try to explain herself, and he literally and figuratively turned his back on her.
So did he know at that time too she was married to another man?
That came out shortly after the quote fake baby came out, in that while she was in this relationship with Ray, she was in a common law marriage with, the best way to describe him is basically kind of a drunken buffoon, a guy named Josh Mann, who she thought she was attracted to in some way. She kind of felt sorry for him, I think. And his mother was involved in it as well. So it was Ray, Josh, and his mother, a woman named Anna Swinton. But Ray, when Ray wasn't around, and he wasn't around a lot, she would be with Josh. And in fact, when she would ask Ray for money, quite often in those 4 years, that money would go to support Josh. So, and that all came out in sort of litigation down the road, bank records and accounts in her name with Josh as the beneficiary, and all kinds of things. So Ray didn't know any of it.
So this must have kind of hurt his reputation.
It really did. He was he stayed at a friend's house, with the curtains drawn. He couldn't go out. Everybody, the question in the press basically every day was essentially, and how can such a smart man be so stupid? And everybody was trying to get at, kind of what was he thinking? But he never addressed the press directly. His friends would address them from time to time, saying, he feels bad, whatever. But his reputation was pretty well shot. So to the extent that the following year in 1890, he said basically the heck with it and moved out west. In June of 1890, he resettled in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
While this was happening, did Ray's family stand behind him?
They did. There were a few letters from his father to Ray that are still around, and his father says, basically after Eva's trial and her conviction, he wrote to Ray to say he was proud of, Ray's comportment and demeanor throughout all of it. Privately, they weren't so pleased, only because that's not the way Hamilton's got their name in the newspaper, basically. But, it's still a father backing his son. So, and his brother also, stood by his side, but his reputation clearly had taken a beating.
How did she end up? She was convicted of this, right?
She was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in the Trenton State Prison. She served about 2 years. She figured out while she was there that there was a pay-for-play pardon system with basically the corrupt New Jersey governor, a guy named Leon Abbott at the time. And if you had the right amount of money and had the right lawyer, you could get a pardon. And the going rate was basically $1,000. She found an attorney that the governor liked, or who was in the governor's pocket, basically, paid him $1,000, and she was granted a pardon after 2 years. Wow.
Now, if I'm reading right, what happened to Ray himself?
Yeah, I don't want to make it. I guess there's no other way to say it without it sort of being a spoiler. But Ray went to Jackson Hole, and his intention was he was only there a couple of weeks before he started working on a new real estate development project. Basically, he wanted to build a grand hunting lodge. The trains were, Yellowstone by that time was a national park. Trains from the East Coast were going out west more frequently. It was easier to get to. And, a lot of, Wall Street guys, who today say, let's all get together and go out hunting and fishing and all that stuff. They did that then. But it was still pretty desolate out in Jackson Hole. And he wanted to build a lodge that basically rich Wall Street guys could come and kind of live comfortably while they were out there hunting and fishing. He just a few weeks after he was there, he arrived in June of 1890. He met a guy named John Dudley Sargent, who was also an Easterner of sort of shamed reputation. He was a long-lost cousin of the painter John Singer Sargent. The Sargent family was a East Coast, Maine and Massachusetts moneyed family. John was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and he had moved out there with his young family, and he had homesteaded the property on Coulter Bay. If you or any of your listeners have been to Jackson Hole, Coulter Bay is probably, it's one of the most desirable pieces of real estate on Jackson Lake, directly across from the Tetons. It's breathtaking. He homesteaded that, and once Ray realized, he had the best piece of property out there, he was also an East Coast guy, they partnered up to build a hunting lodge called Merrymere. The construction was going along well. Ray went off, decided that it was going well enough that he could go off on a little hunting trip by himself. All of the guys working at the camp said, don't do that. You don't know the territory well enough. And Ray insisted on doing it. He went out and I'll just say met with unfortunate circumstances, and never unfortunate and for a long time mysterious circumstances. And that was essentially the end of him. I'll leave the rest of it for people reading the book. But that kicked off a whole nother set of circumstances involving Eva.
Well, yeah, because right away that leads to suspicion of she did something to him or had something done to him, right?
That was definitely one suspicion. John Sargent wasn't, by all accounts, the most, put together guy. Some people thought maybe their business relationship had gone sour. Some people thought that Ray kind of might have faked these circumstances to just go off and get lost for a couple of years and kind of come back with a new identity. There were all kinds of crazy theories floating around out there, but the main thing that happened was because there was a marriage certificate between Ray and Eva. Obviously, Ray had, or maybe not so obviously, Ray had, as soon as the stabbing and conviction had happened, he cut her out of his will 100%. But at the time, a woman had what was called dower rights, and regardless of what was on stated in a will, a woman was entitled to at least, it varied by state, but in New York it was a 1/3 of the entire estate. And the Hamilton family, was not eager in any way, shape, or form to give Eva a penny. She challenged it all in court, and that set off a whole new months-long saga of newspaper stories. She loved attention. She loved being the center of everything. And so the newspapers would report, what she was wearing every day to court, how she made her court entrances, if whatever was happening in court, might be, it would be to her sympathy to, cry or show tears. She would turn on the tears. If she needed to be indifferent or angry, she could be that too. So it was all, in a way, kind of an act for her, but she really wanted the money, and the Hamilton family went to great lengths to prevent that. They were basically saying because she was in a common law marriage, her marriage to Ray was invalid. And eventually it went to the New York State Supreme Court. They sided with Ray's family. Ray's family was represented by a gentleman named Elihu Root, who at that time was one of the top attorneys in New York. He was very well connected. He went on to be McKinley's Secretary of War, and then Teddy Roosevelt's Secretary of War, and then Secretary of State. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912. But in the 1890s, he was really a top-flight New York lawyer, basically, and he's the one that was able to have the Hamilton family prevail. After it was ruled against her in New York State Supreme Court, she came up with one other plan. She had a forged document saying that Ray had promised all this money to her. And the Hamilton family said, basically, enough's enough, and gave her $10,000 and, said, never darken our door again. And that in the end is what settled it. So, she wanted what she wanted.
Yeah. Why didn't Ray divorce her?
Because the divorce was in the works when he left the incident happened in August of 1889, right? In January, he started divorce proceedings. Divorces weren't very common at that time. It took a long time for them to wind their way through the courts. They were very expensive in terms of legal fees and all of that stuff. So there was no such thing as kind of a quickie divorce. So he had initiated divorce proceedings in January of 1890. But when these unfortunate circumstances occurred in August of 1890, the divorce was not yet final. So he was technically still married to her, if you were to believe the marriage certificate.
Why didn't he just have her killed?
Well, do we?
You know, I have not been asked that question before.
Well, you know, he's got connections. He's got that. You know, he's got detectives, and
He definitely had. Well, you know, actually, when he went away to Jackson Hole, she was in prison, and so I'm not sure how he could have arranged something like that while she was behind bars. I suppose it's possible, but when he left for Jackson Hole, she was safely incarcerated, and it was, you know, due to be another 2.5 years before she would be out. And nobody thought that the circumstances would come up where she would be fighting with his family over his estate.
Wow. Do we know what happened to the baby?
We do, and I write about it. You know, the entire book took about 2.5 years to research, and during most of that time, I was on the hunt for what happened to Beatrice, and a lot of dead ends trying to figure that out. She had several guardians, right? You know, from 1890 through the first decade of the 20th century. I finally found somebody who was, I thought I had a good shot of being, you know, connected to her family, and I contacted them. They were sort of by marriage, and I asked if any of her descendants would like to speak to me, if there were any documents, photographs, anything. And it came back that the family knew that Beatrice had a very difficult life in her first years. She never spoke about it, never wanted to speak about it. And out of respect for her privacy, they declined it. So out of respect for their wishes, I abided by that. I do know that she basically changed her name as early as maybe when she was 16 or by the age 18. She moved about as far away from New York as you could and remained in the United States. And by all accounts, you know, had a healthy and full life. She had children and grandchildren, and, you know, lived to an old age. So, but out of respect for the family's wishes, and as you read the book, you know, poor Beatrice is just, you know, what a way to begin life. So I respected that.
Now, one of the things that seems to be really important to you, especially in this book, because even in part of the title is you talk about the dawn of tabloid journalism and stuff. So maybe talk a little bit about that, what you mean by that.
Right. So when I began researching the book and trying to tell the story in full, I was able to, because all of Eva's courtroom stuff was appealed to the New York State Supreme Court, you know, there was the initial criminal trial and then all of her civil action. All the testimony and courtroom documents from her criminal trial were rolled into her civil action, and that was all in the Supreme Court. So when I found those court documents, and there's roughly 1,000 pages of them, everything was there from a sort of officialdom point of view. I also found a box of letters in the New York the New York City Historical Society of people, nothing in Ray's hand, but friends and family members who had written to him while all of this was going on, expressing their feelings about it all. And then I started looking at newspaper accounts, and the more newspaper accounts I found, the more that popped up. And so one of the things that, just from a research point of view, I was comparing the newspaper accounts to what was happening in the courtroom. You know, a newspaper that said, so-and-so said this, and then I could check the courtroom testimony to see if that was the case. So sometimes they did report accurately. I would say there was not a lot of fact checking going on in newspaper reporting at that time, particularly with the more sensational New York papers, The World, the New York Sun, but even to a degree, the Tribune and the New York Times. And it hit me that really the newspaper accounts and how or what the media does with a celebrity scandal intrigued me. So, readers of the book will see a lot of headlines in there that sensational headlines from newspapers, how the story was happening versus what was being reported in the newspapers, and how each side, particularly when it got to the civil action, Ray's family versus Eva's side, used the media to try to manipulate the media to kind of win in the court of public opinion. And that fascinates me in terms of, as I said earlier, it's really not that different than it is now. There are more outlets now, certainly, but all of the ways that we take in news, it was much the same then. And the fact that when you look at newspapers then, most of them were published as 8-page editions. And a front page, there's no photographs. Sometimes a little kind of pen and ink illustration might be on a front page, but a front page might consist of 20 sort of short stories. So for a story, as I said, to command a full column on page one was rare. And Ray and Eva were full columns, front page, every day for months on end. And, if you imagine at that time picking up your local paper, it was clearly kind of going to be the first thing you read about. And the newspapers couldn't get enough of their story. It was everything that makes a great story in terms of the haves and have-nots and the privileged and unprivileged and these crazy circumstances that kept unfolding almost like a sort of a melodrama, and I was just taken by that, and I really wanted to make sure that how the media, and that was relatively new in terms of the way newspapers told a story, the sort of sensationalism of not just this story, but anything that could be sensationalized generally was. There were more people who could read in the 1890s than could 50 years before, and it was an outlet for somebody who just wanted to take in news on a daily basis.
Well, it's interesting that you have to wonder if it would have, how it would do today. Like today's got similar. There's so much more access to this sort of stuff now with the internet, and
right?
All that stuff. You kind of have to wonder.
Where Eva's criminal trial was after the stabbing, it was in a little town in New Jersey called Mays Landing, which is about 20 miles inland from Atlantic City. And it was the county seat of Atlantic County. And the courthouse is still there. It's been added on to in the wings, but the original courthouse is still there. And it's a courthouse that sat maybe 75 people or so, had, large windows wrapped around the building. And when Eva's trial was going on, you couldn't get, people would line up, both locals, vacationers from Atlantic City were coming up to the trial. Ray's friends came down from New York for it. And it was the courtroom was so crowded, not only standing room, they had to close the doors. They would open the windows on the side, and newspaper reporters would be on stepladders, listening through the window at what was going on in the court. And, you know, if you went down that little main street in Mays Landing today, you know, I mean, that would just be filled with satellite trucks and reporters doing, you know, stand-ups outside of the, you know, as people entered the courtroom. Here's you know, the testimony is expected to go till 4:00 this afternoon or whatever it is. And then, you know, rushing people when they came out to get their reaction of what happened inside. It was all of the same thing. And
Nancy Grace would be sitting in there.
They all would be. They all would be, for sure. And, you know, it's as a funny little aside, there's the courthouse. There was the county jail right behind it. And next to it was the sheriff's house. It was a guy named Smith Johnson, who was the sheriff at the time. And his wife, after Eva was convicted, she had 2 weeks until she had to report to Trenton. And so the sheriff's wife, Jenny, had taken a liking to her and said, you don't have to stay in the jail. You can stay basically in the third floor of our house, kind of a dormer, attic kind of thing. And there were 2 young boys living in the house. And one of them, I don't know if you've ever seen the series Broadway Empire, and Nucky Thompson, who was the Prohibition kingpin of Atlantic City. It was based on the real character, Nucky Johnson, who was one of the little boys of Sheriff Johnson who was living in that house. So Eva and Nucky shared quarters for a couple of weeks there in 1889. So,
Wow.
But, you know, that was just, and actually when the sheriff took her to, had to take her to Trenton, basically you could get on a train and go about whatever it was, 40 miles down the road to Trenton and be there in 45 minutes. He took her on a coach. They took a train northward to Elizabeth, New Jersey, transferred another train coming back down, all in an effort to throw off the press. They left at 4:00 in the morning, but the press, as the press would do, is on stakeout. And so they managed to get on the trains and all of that stuff. And, you know, they wrote the story saying, Sheriff Johnson took a roundabout way to take, you know, Eva Hamilton to jail, thinking that he would throw off reporters. Well, reporters are, you know, basically too savvy for that, and wondered why, he spent the taxpayer money to buy these train tickets and take this roundabout way when they were basically, you know, one car behind him in the train the entire time. So, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and he actually interviewed with, or she interviewed with Nellie Bly, you say. I remember we've talked about her on the show before. What did she say in her interview? Did she say anything kind of shocking? Or?
She did. She, well, you know, obviously your listeners are familiar with Nellie Bly, basically credited with, inventing investigative reporting. And, you know, Nellie Bly loved to get the side of stories that nobody else was telling, right? And she went down to Trenton because now the Hamilton family had put a full court press on the press to say that basically Ray's a good guy. He got mixed up with a terrible woman. And Nellie Bly showed up unannounced at Trenton, convinced the head keeper of the jail to let her interview Eva. Eva was not ready for it, but, anybody who wanted to listen to her side of the story, you know, she was all for it. So Eva said that the baby was actually a friend of Ray's, was the daughter of a friend of Ray's who was a married man who had gotten a woman pregnant and needed to protect his marriage. So Ray agreed that he would raise the baby and paid Eva extra money to do that. She said that Ray had forced her to have an abortion twice before Beatrice was born. I forget what, I can't think off the top of my head, but there was one other, it'll come to me in a sec, but she just was spinning yarns, basically. Eva was a storyteller all of her life. She said that it was her who initiated the divorce with Ray because she'd already suspected that after 8 months of marriage that he was being unfaithful to her. So none of this, I don't know about the unfaithfulness, but the other parts of her story were, soundly refuted in court. But, Eva was, some people that have read the book have empathy for Eva in that she does a lot of terrible things. But, at that time, there were not very many opportunities for women in the first place, particularly women who lacked an education. And you kind of did what you needed to do to get by. And Eva was one of those people. There were all kinds of scams and confidence games and stuff like that went on at that time. And it was people who didn't have money, who saw all these Gilded Age, robber barons and industrialists building these giant mansions and having these, incredible art collections. And on one hand, they would look at awe at those people, but the other hand was like, well, why do they have that and I don't? They must have so much that they can afford to give me some. And however way they could kind of manage to do that, they would try. And Eva kind of fell into that category. So she told whatever stories she needed to tell to advance her station in life, basically.
Human nature, it's still the same.
Human nature, it doesn't change. And after Marianne Donnelly recovered from her stabbing, she had to testify in court, and it came out that she was a pretty mean and ornery alcoholic herself. After she recovered, she was paid. There were basically freak shows. They were called dime museums, and there was a number of them on the Bowery in New York, and one of the biggest was a place called the Globe Museum. And the Globe Museum hired Marianne Donnelly to sit in a room for an hour, show off the dress with all the slash marks in it from the knife, and answer questions about what happened that morning. And on the stool next to her she had the bottle of whiskey that her and Eva were drinking from that morning. And she was paid $75 a week to do it, which at that time was a pretty good chunk of dough. And she basically said, I'm a little bit embarrassed to do it, but clearly I'm not going to work as a baby nurse anymore. And, I got to get by. So that whole kind of getting by is what people did.
Yeah. Well, pay me $75, I'd wear a dress and talk too, right? My God. And what kind of baby nurse is drinking at 7 a.m. whiskey? But hey, not being judgmental here.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating. Fascinating story. Great book. Recommend it for everybody. We'll have this up on our website. People can find it with one click. And of course, it's called The Scandalous Hamiltons. And our guest has been the author, Bill Shaffer. Thank you for being here, Bill.
Oh, thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate you having me.
Thanks, Bill.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.